Hi, folks. First of all, I should just explain the lighting. Well, I've said this before, my overhead light is broken. So it's just a side light. So, apologies, it's not ideal lighting, but I think this is an important one. I've just come across the reports via MSN News, well, it's actually the Metro, and I won't read out the whole thing, but basically, this is the headline. The reports by Liam O'Dell. Russian TV pundit calls for Britain to be bombed back to the Stone Age. A Russian state pundit has told his country's military to bomb Britain's power stations and take us back to the Stone Age. Broadcaster Yakov Kedmi said Russia should hit the UK with its Zircon missile, a hypersonic missile capable of reaching 6,670 miles per hour. He then suggested one of Russia's nuclear capable Sarmat missiles would be too good for the UK. There's no need to use such a big weapon for Britain at all, he said. One or two and a half launches from multi-purpose submarine with Zircons will be enough. About 50 or 60 of Britain's power stations will be gone in 10 minutes, and Britain will be back to the Stone Age. Within 10 minutes, nothing else is needed. It'll be back to the Stone Age in 10 minutes. Kedmi's desperate remarks come hot on the heels of retired Colonel Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who warned Russia was in full geopolitical isolation after invading Ukraine. He added, however much we would hate to admit this, virtually the entire world is against us. Khodorkovsky also mocked Vladimir Putin's nuclear threat, saying it actually looks rather amusing. Now that's coming from a Russian general. Yet Kedmi joins a long list of Russian broadcasters who appear happy to threaten the UK with big words. Last month, Channel 1's 60 Minutes released a video demonstrating how Europe could be nuked in 200 seconds and leave no survivors. Kremlin propaganda also warned Britain would be plunged into the sea and drowned in radioactive tsunami if Russia launched a nuclear attack. Dmitry Kislyak, widely dubbed Putin's propagandist in chief, was filmed saying what will happen after Boris Johnson's words about a retaliatory strike on Russia. There's more to the report, but you get the picture. Um, when I hear things like this, it just reiterates to me why it was so right that we finally got rid of Russia today. Um, Not that it's the only Russian state broadcaster; it was probably the most prominent outside Russia. But this just reiterates that if RT was still broadcasting, they probably wouldn't be stupid enough to echo those exact words, but they would be spinning it in such a way that they would be there in spirit. Because make no mistake about it, RT was always an ultra nationalist network. Now this guy Kedmi, maybe he's just trying to fill the shoes of the late Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the notorious ultra nationalist leader who just passed away, misnamed liberal Democrat in the Russian context. He was anything but. He was an ultra nationalist, fanatical, racist madman and a bit of a buffoon. Um, for the record, I don't think Russia's going to do anything of the sort. It's not that they're not capable of it. Russia has more nuclear warheads than any other country, including the United States. So, in theory, and it is a sinister thing to comprehend, Russia is capable of taking out British power stations, British cities. It's it's quite frightening, but we can temper that with the reality that um, Putin's bad, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's mad or stupid. He's angry, he's simmering, he knows he's isolated. Um, but I think even he, hopefully at this point, will not be insane enough to make such a move. Because, you know, Russia versus Britain in that context, yeah, they could defeat us. But the collective disgust, not to mention the collective responsibility of NATO, I think the collective disgust of the world would be such that Russia wouldn't be forgiven for 100 years. Whatever the consequences for Germany after World War II would be dwarfed by what would happen to Russia. I think the international outrage and disgust, even countries that were wavering, I think even China would be disgusted by it. This is one area where Russia and China think differently. China is always about internal affairs. This is not to say that China is pacifist, it's not. And it's a myth that China's never invaded anywhere, just ask the Vietnamese. But I do think there is starting to develop a little bit of a gulf between Beijing and Moscow. Now, Beijing's never going to back the West, but that could be an interesting development. I think what Beijing is doing is looking at these developments to see what they might do with Taiwan. Um, but I think it shows where the Russian regime is at. And I count all these civilian broadcasters as part of the regime because they're doing Putin's dirty work in that sense. It shows where they're at, to make these wild rants about nuclear annihilation. It shows that they've long given up on any moral argument. I mean, their debunked claims to denazify Ukraine, which virtually no one except brainwashed Russians believed, and even many Russians know it's nonsense. Um, I reiterate how much respect I have for courageous Russians who stand up against this regime, because when you think of how unhinged they are, lashing out at foreigners, imagine the sort of attitude they would take to Russians who know that it's wrong. I mean, they're going to be deemed as traitors, and they don't just face imprisonment, they face physical threats. It must be a very, very uncomfortable position to be in, and yet they are still taking the risks and doing it. So we must never allow these Russian nationalist thugs to turn us against the entire nation of Russia. Nevertheless, geopolitics being what it is, the Russian state is definitely our enemy. I don't think we can pretend that we're neutral in this. We're not. It's not just about Ukraine. Important as Ukraine is, and as much as this has been a wake up call, um, as the president of Finland said, the reason that countries are going to NATO is not because they want to threaten Russia, it's because Russia's antics have forced them into this as a means of protection. And to people around the world who say, well, Russia's being threatened by NATO, ask yourselves, why is it Finland and Sweden are doing this when they, especially Sweden, has been neutral for decades? In fact, in the case of Sweden, I believe it's 200 years. Why would they suddenly decide to join NATO? It's because they genuinely feel that Russia is a threat. Russia under Putin. I mean, I said he's not mad, but it is a bit mad to do what he's done, to invade a sovereign nation um, in the context of just trying to wipe it off the map. And that's, by the way, also why analogies with Iraq are flawed. Yes, Iraq was an invasion, but the British and Americans never said Iraq wasn't a country. So that is a fundamental difference. And it's why lazy comparisons need to be scrutinized a little bit. It was a disaster. I don't equivocate on that. But it's bemusing to see these sort of wild rants. It's disgusting. But it's bemusing because I honestly think that they no longer care what the world thinks. And it could be that they're actually frightened. That's why they're lashing out. Because Russia's a very powerful country. Like I said, it's got more nuclear warheads than anywhere. But for all of that, it's got a pretty lackluster economy, which has been seriously weakened by the sanctions. As we've seen from the ground, its actual management, it may have a huge military, but its efficiency is very questionable. Um, I mean, if Russia cannot defeat a much smaller country in Ukraine after, what is it, 3 months now of war, um, then how is it going to take on more powerful countries like Britain, France, especially the United States? So I think this is just bully boy tactics. I think these thugs, these Russian nationalist hawks. I remember RT had a program ironically entitled "Watching the Hawks," when really the whole time they should have been watching themselves. Um, but anyway, I did ponder a while back: should we maybe take it seriously? Should we maybe prepare Cold War style with nuclear drills and so on? I don't know. I think we should have some contingency in place. I think it is highly unlikely this will happen, but we can't be complacent. I mean, we're dealing with a regime that I believe is utterly depraved. I mean, they treat their own soldiers like cannon fodder. They've totally brutalized the Ukrainian people. It's an utterly depraved regime. So maybe they are capable of anything, and that's quite sinister. But I honestly believe that, this concept of mutually assured destruction, well, obviously, anti-nuclear activists have long said that if a country was to attack us, then it would show that the nuclear deterrent has failed, and they'd be right about that. Um, but Russia knows that. Russia knows that if it starts a nuclear war, then let's say, for the sake of argument, and I don't say this flippantly. Let's say they decided to take out one of our big nuclear power stations, or even a city, Hull, Liverpool, Birmingham, whatever it might be. Um, hundreds of thousands of casualties. The rage in this country would be such that I think, unfortunately, even anti-Putin Russians would be targeted. I think there would be such seething hatred of Russia as a country and a culture that it would be unsafe for any Russian to live in this country. And I hope to goodness that never happens. Because obviously it would be awful for anti-Putin Russians to be tarred with the same brush. In fact, there's already signs of that happening. Ridiculous. In fact, I believe we should work with them to try and topple this evil regime. Um, I honestly think we're at the point where we should encourage a coup d'etat. So what? I don't care if people say, "Oh, it's interfering." I think Putin's out of control. But anyway, let's say that was to happen. Well, under the principle of collective responsibility, other NATO countries would be obliged to retaliate. And even if it was conventional warfare, the firebombing of Tokyo in World War II killed more people than the A bombs. So, conventional warfare doesn't necessarily mean that it would be less deadly than nuclear war in terms of a bombing raid. I mean, it's depressing to even think about these things, but this is where we're at. It's no longer inconceivable. I think it's highly unlikely, but it's not inconceivable. There are reports of Putin's health is on the line. If he suddenly died, I mean, remember, in the 1980s, you had Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko all died within years of each other, and the Kremlin really tried to cover up their health. It might be the same with Putin. The problem is if he suddenly dies, there could be a power vacuum, and it's not necessarily that a moderate will take over. If someone like Lavrov takes over, he's just as bad. So it wouldn't necessarily be that if Putin's gone, this problem is solved. Um, but it could also trigger a major people's uprising in Russia, finally, that will overthrow this regime. One can hope, because I honestly think, for Russia's sake and for the sake of the world, that would be a good thing. I genuinely believe that. I'm not saying a Russian civil war would be a good thing, but if it could be a revolution equivalent to those in 1989, largely bloodless, that would be a very, very good thing. Um, But if something does escalate, we need to take a note of all these broadcasters, because they need to end up the same way as the Nuremberg war criminals. I think they're just as culpable as generals are on the battlefield. I honestly think each of these people, and there's more than one of them, I think they're the equivalent of Joseph Goebbels. I really do. And I believe that if this escalates, they should end up the same way as the Nuremberg war criminals. If we don't use the death penalty, they should be in prison for the rest of their days for initiating and supporting this well, such an escalation. I mean, the thing is, it's no longer hyperbole. I think we're dealing with a dangerous enemy, and I don't think they will do it. But I don't think we can be complacent. I think we are in the most dangerous situation in Europe, certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis in the world, and since 1983. That's a lesser known part of the Cold War where the tensions were also extremely high. There was particular points, in fact, there was a Russian officer at one of those nuclear facilities. Um, I forget the guy's name now, but he was labeled the man who saved the world because he had a split decision to make whether it was an incoming American missile, and he judged it was just a malfunction of the radar device system, and it was actually the sun's rays reflecting on it. And his decision not to retaliate, not to shoot down that missile, well, there was no missile, possibly saved the world from nuclear war. Um, and he was initially shunned for exposing the Soviet Union's weaknesses. But in later years, he was, widely praised um, by outsiders for his quick thinking. So we need people like that with a level head around right now, not fanatics like Kedmi and others. Um, it makes, who's Putin listening to? Is he listening to level heads or is he listening to fanatics? Unfortunately, it seems more likely that he's listening to the fanatics. Um, and it shows, ultranationalism can be a very, very dangerous thing, especially when you have militarism behind it. I honestly think no leader has threatened the world this much in my lifetime, and I'm including Xi Jinping, who's a brutal dictator. I mean, most of Xi's excesses are within China. So, yeah, I think in my lifetime, no one has threatened the world the way Putin has. I'm including all the American presidents. I'm including all the dictators. I honestly think when you weigh it up, context, per head of countries, are and so on, I think Putin is the most dangerous leader of my lifetime. I mean, sure, you get someone like Kim Jong Un who's a loon, but North Korea is it's really not on the same scale as Russia. So that's the only reason I make that difference. And you get plenty of savage dictators who do horrible things within their own countries, but again, they don't have the power of Russia. So that's my thoughts. I honestly think that there's no point saying we're in a new Cold War because that's a given. And I think it's possibly more dangerous because in the Cold War there was an avenue of communication. Maybe that's what Macron's logic is, that this is why it's important to keep up communication with Putin. But Putin's not listening. So I think Macron runs the risk of being seen as another Neville Chamberlain.